what faith is in our lives and what it can do for us. Let's read Genesis 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He called to him, Abraham, and Abraham answered, Yes, here I am. Take your son, God said, your only son Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. There on the mountain that I will show you, offer him as a sacrifice to me. Early the next morning, Abraham cut some wood for the sacrifice, loaded his donkey, and took Isaac and 2 servants with him. They started out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the place in the distance. Then he said to the servants, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there and worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham made Isaac carry the wood for the sacrifice, and he himself carried a knife and live coals for starting the fire. As they walked along, Isaac spoke up, Father. He answered, Yes, son. Isaac asked, I see that you have the coals and the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Abraham answered, God himself will provide one. And the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place which God had told them about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. He tied up his son and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he picked up the knife to kill him. But the angel of the Lord called to him from the heaven, Abraham, Abraham. He answered, Yes, here I am. Don't hurt the boy or do anything to him, he said. Now I know that you honor and obey God, because you have not kept back your only son from him. Abram looked around and saw a ram caught in a bush by its horns. He went and got it and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abram named that place, The Lord Provides. And even today people say, on the Lord's mountain he provides. Every journey has a purpose, a destination, a goal. Back in January, Pastor Don and I went on a 35-day, 8-country around the world tour. Every tour of that length is going to have some low points. And after a week in New Zealand is a beautiful, picturesque country. It has beautiful beaches, and we loved visiting Hobbittown. We had a wonderful VRBO host. And then we went to the airport, Auckland, for our second leg to get to Vietnam. And I was realizing that they had emailed me from Vietnam and said that I'd forgot to put my middle initial on the visa application. And so on Tuesday, on the week that we were traveling on Friday, I finally got to it to correct it. Well, that wasn't soon enough. And at the airport, they told me, you're not going to make it into Vietnam. We can send you to Malaysia, but we can't get you to Vietnam. And I tried to sweet talk my way into it, but you don't do that. If you've ever seen Nate Bargatze on his Netflix comedy show talking about dealing with Delta, he says, Delta has my name as Nathan. The passport says Nathaniel. And the guys at Delta always says, we got a problem. And Nate says, well, you know, the name's about 70% right. The picture is 100% correct. I think 170% should get me through. And he says, no, I'm surprised you made it this far. And so Nate says, what do I do? Yeah, just go home. Nate kind of utters under his breath saying, I don't even tell him that my friends call me Nate. He'd probably look at the police officer and tell him just to shoot me from where he's at. I also wasn't successful in getting to Vietnam, but I did email the embassy at Vietnam, or the visa department, and I think we landed in Australia, and there was no, it was getting close. Vietnam's ahead of us by 12 hours, and so it was getting close to their closing time Friday afternoon. And it had not come through by Australia, but sure enough, by the time we got to Malaysia, my visa had come through. Problem was, as we tried to get on the plane in Malaysia, they discovered that Don had one number wrong on his visa passport. Now, if you've flown all night, you might have been sleeping, but that's not really sleep. We all know that. But it was a beautiful coffee shop, but it was also fraught with distress. We prayed a lot, sweated a lot, and had a phone number from her travel agent back home. She happened to be awake at midnight when we first got into my problem. And I think it's a little bit of a scheme. There seems to be a lot of problems with Vietnam visas, but there's no problems in Vietnam that money can't fix. So for a lot of extra money and an escort, we did get through. So what if the purpose of our journey was actually the problems of our journey? We look at the destination as being the ultimate, but in this journey that we look at tonight, it was the purpose, the frustration. What do you do when God asks you for the impossible? And that's what we want to talk about tonight. God asks Abraham for this ultimate sacrifice. And when we look at Isaac, he's the miracle boy. You know, Abraham had finally made it kind of into the good times. So we're looking at, he had problems with a greedy nephew, and they had problems with the stubborn pregnancy issues. But now all of a sudden they had a miracle boy, and life was going well. And now this. You would certainly think that Isaac would not be the victim of an accidental death, and for sure not a premeditated death. But yet here is God asking Abram to give this ultimate sacrifice. And God specifically says to Abraham, your son, whom you love so much. Now, if we just look at this from the surface, we miss a couple things. Your only son designates that Ishmael era is over. You're done with Hagar. That's done with. That was a mistake. That problem is out of your life. You have one son and one son only. And then he talks about whom you love so much. We are 22 chapters into Genesis. This is the first time that love is mentioned. Can you believe the God of love waits 22 chapters to say it, and then he doesn't talk about himself. He talks about the relationship between a father and a son. What's up with that? We'll see as we digest this whole scenario, because we basically have to digest it. We can't just swallow this whole idea of sacrificing a son. Now, given the cultural circumstances, Abram had nobody else to report to. There was no governmental authority that was going to incarcerate him or hang him for killing his son. There was probably no peers that he had, whether he could get suggestions from them as to what is the best thing to do. God's telling me to do this. What do you think? He wasn't going to use feelings or emotions. He had heard from God, and he was going to listen to God. But before God asks for this sacrifice, God simply says, Abraham. And no code words, no excuses, no buts. One simple request. God wants Abraham's attention. At this point in life, Abraham had enough encounters with God to recognize the voice of God. And here's a recap. First of all, God told Abram to pack up and move to a land where, I'll tell you when you get there. It's like they didn't have any kids, but if they would have had kids and they said, Dad, are we there yet? He would have just had to shrug his shoulders and say, why don't you ask God? He's the only one that seems to know. God also promised Abraham and Sarah a great nation. And because of Sarah's infertility, she suggested that Abraham have a baby with her maid Hagar. Abraham jumped on the chance, pun intended, and it proved to be a disaster. And then he allowed his nephew Lot to have first pick of the land. When your future prosperity is crops and agriculture, animals, water, and pasture is everything. When you let somebody else have first pick, that means you have faith. And then twice, on the downside, Abram lied about Sarah being his wife to royalty, and they actually took Sarah into their harems, and God prevailed and intervened. I call this era of Abram's life, liar, liar, man of faith. And tonight's scripture is about faith. No more lying, no more having babies with Egyptian maids. Abraham is ready to do what God is requesting. So Genesis gives us these four-word phrases that summarize his faith. And I personally internalize these words, and I suggest that every one of us does. It starts with a call. Every one of us is going to get that call. Am I humble enough, ready to submit, to drop everything so that I can have God's call in my life? As we hear that call, we process the request, and then we think of our longings, our desires, our dreams, and they probably run counter to what God's desire is for us. The question is, do we submit to the call or do we fight? And the best way to describe the submission that Abraham had is the first of these three faith responses, and it's with the four-word phrase, yes, here I am. It says everything about myself and about my God and my relationship with him. It puts it in the proper perspective. It says, you are God, I am not. It says that you created me to reflect your glory. I'm not here for myself. I'm here for your cause, God. And then it also puts it in the right perspective by saying, I'm curious, God, what do you have in store for me? He's always got a surprise waiting for us, usually way beyond, in fact, the Bible says, way beyond our imagination. It embraces the idea that God is more holy, more lofty than we are. We, in respectful reverence, are ready to listen. And why not? After all, our plan Bs, our way of doing things haven't worked in the past, just like they never worked for Abram. The big difference in his life was when he followed God and when he followed himself. But just because he quickly responded, it didn't mean that the request was easy by any means. The sacrifice of his only son. It had to be a rough night for Abraham. I doubt whether he told Sarah. We don't know that. But as we analyze life's tragedies, poverty, sickness, loss of life, at the top of those lists is the loss of a child. I've asked Cornell to speak about how we deal with that and how we deal with the fear of it. Cornell.
I agree with Mark that it's, for most people, the most painful experience that they could possibly have. And we don't even want to talk about it. It's that painful. But we have to remember that the depth of grief is equal to the depth of our love. We wouldn't want to sacrifice that love, and therefore the grief is something that is just equal to it. I remember when Ivan was born, a friend told me, congratulations, now good luck living with your heart outside of your body. And it is extremely true. The vulnerability of having a little person that you love more than life itself just puts you in such a place of really fear. When they're little, we worry about their physical well-being, but the fear escalates as they grow older, because then we start worrying about their mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being as well. And when we're in a place of fear, it is just natural to want to go into control. And this is what happens, and why all of parenting really is a journey of faith and a journey of loss. Because we want to micromanage them. We want to turn them into the people we think they need to be. And we forget that everybody has to be fully convicted in their own mind, and that the ultimate point of life is that relationship with God where you live and move and have your being in Him. And we cannot deprive our children of that experience and of that opportunity because of our fear. And so we justify things, and we justify that control, and we use even the 10 Commandments to turn control into obedience. And that is a real problem. And ultimately, we need to remember that every child has to be released into the world, and that's a scary thing to do. We release them ultimately to their destruction because nobody gets out of this life alive. And so that is part of the parenting journey that requires so much faith. And every stage of development has losses involved. We have to let them go to make their own decisions and to become the people they are destined to be. We cannot control that process. But we are hardwired to love our children, and with that depth of love, there is a lot of grief that happens, and especially if the perception of a more permanent loss through death happens to us. And it completely tears the fabric of our entire existence. We cannot have a sense of stability and security and confidence when something like that happens, not initially. It is so destabilizing. And we're just so incredibly aware of our vulnerability at that moment. And yeah, we know that in the back of our minds, most people think that death is reserved for old people. So nobody really expects a young person to die. So it is just so much more devastating. Even though we know it can happen, nobody really expects it ever. Otherwise, nobody would have children. But it does. And David Kessler continued the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And so if you need to learn a little bit more about death and dying and bereavement, that is really the seminal work to go and look at. And they identified 6 stages of grief, and they are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and ultimately acceptance and finding meaning. We, on some level, all of us really know that we are caught between 2 worlds. We don't feel at home in this world. We know we're not designed for grief and death and loss and pain. At the same time, we also know ourselves well enough that we don't feel like we really belong in heaven in God's perfection either. And that is why Jesus is the bridge between those 2 worlds, so that, as 1 Thessalonians 4 tells us, we can grieve with faith. We can grieve with hope. And grief really is a river. Some of us walk into it very slowly as we watch a loved one die. Other people, and especially with the loss of a child, is plunged into that river, and it feels like we're drowning. But if we trust and we have faith, that river will take us to a place that we want to go. If we trust and we just continue through the process that is completely natural and completely normal. There is no perfect way to grieve. It takes as long as it takes. There's no way anybody can tell you what you should be feeling or for how long. The only way through it is going through the emotions. Eric Clapton wrote a song called Tears in Heaven. I don't know how many of you know it. It won 3 Grammys. So it became really famous, and he wrote it in response to his son Connor's death. And Connor was 4 years old when he fell to his death through a window of the 53rd story of a New York apartment building. And it was such a devastating loss. Clapton had become sober when Connor was born, and he was so devastated that everybody feared for his sobriety. But he found meaning through rekindling a relationship with an estranged daughter and his continued sobriety. But I think this song just tells us so much of just the devastation of that loss, the fears, the inadequacy, and all those emotions that a grieving parent goes through. So I've asked Maggie to play that for us with the lyrics. So there's no greater testimony than somebody who has lived that experience.
I saw you in heaven, would it be the same? If I saw you in heaven, I must be strong and carry on, 'cause I know I don't belong here in heaven. Would you hold my hand if I saw you in heaven? Would you help me stand if I saw you in heaven? I'll find my way through night and day, 'cause I know I just can't stay here in heaven. Time can bring you down, time can bend your knee. Time can break your heart, have you begging please, begging beyond the door. There's peace and sure, and I know there'll be no more tears in heaven. Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven? Would it be the same if I saw you in heaven? I must be strong and carry on, 'cause I know I don't belong here in heaven. 'Cause I know I don't belong here in heaven.
It's at those times that just can't, you just don't have the words to share with people who go through that type of grief. And I think that Abraham, in that mountain journey, had that grief every step of the way, understanding this was tragedy. This was what God was asking. But there's no doubt that we weren't created to die. It was only sin that brought that into the picture. It appeared like Abraham did busy work to keep his mind off this impending doom. It says that Abraham saddled his own donkey, he chopped his own firewood. If you've got hundreds of servants, you don't do that kind of work, but you do it if you need to stay busy. And But the second phrase in our faith journey, in Abram's faith journey, is early in the morning. It denotes action. It denotes the next possible opportunity to take action. And that's the phrase that I want each one of us to internalize. I think many of us out here in rural country know the value of starting early. Back when I started my business, I realized in a hurry that there's going to be problems on the road as I was delivering cheese, that I could make up that time by starting, if I started early. I remember one day, well, first of all, I had, I needed to be reliable because I had, on Tuesdays, I needed to be in Ashtabula, Wednesdays, Elyria and Lorraine, and on Thursdays, I had to be in Youngstown. And so I had to finish the day ahead. I couldn't just show up whenever I wanted to. My retailers were counting on me to be there at the right time. I usually, at the right day for sure, and usually I like to be there about the same time. But this one day, well, I had less than reliable trucks back in the 70s and 80s. That's kind of what happened. But also, I had my own ignorance to contend with. This one day, I had 3 flat tires. It was a combination of an overloaded truck and me being too frugal to buy radial tires and then a 90-degree day. But I must say that because I'd started early, I did accomplish, I got all 3 tires fixed and still made my route that day. Just to show that when we start early, we are avoiding the procrastination. We are avoiding the problems that come our way by starting later. So many times we make excuses for not starting when God calls us to do something. We make excuses, we procrastinate, we fear something. So let's internalize those 4 words early the next morning. Abram's son Isaac also got involved. He carried the firewood, which is symbolic of Jesus 2,000 years later, carrying his own cross. Early the next morning symbolizes action. And that action again goes back to, you notice that when Cornell and I talk, we talk a lot about fear. Fear is a problem, and we cannot think our way out of a fear. We all know that. You will not think yourself out of a fear tonight. We only get out of a fear if we take action for it. And it takes faith to act, and then if we've gone to church too long, then we think that faith that we have, that action is what saves us. It never saves us. It's our response to the faith that we have, to the love that God has for us. And then our actions take us right into the mouth of fear. Every step Abraham took him closer to that ultimate fearful end, that end that he was fearing, and yet it was action. God requires action. Every time we've got a problem, there will be an action. It will be a difficult action. Faith is hard, but going our own way is hard, and only we get to choose our hard. And it depends on if we're looking at things eternally or looking at things for temporary comfort. So Abram woke up and walked right into his most prominent fear, the loss of his precious son. And our faith journey needs to start ASAP, as soon as possible, early the next morning. Let's personalize this phrase. So Isaac notices we've got fire, we've got wood, but no lamb. 2 out of 3 is probably not going to work. And Abram's answer is the answer for the ages. God himself will provide. That's our third phrase, and it's the answer of redemption. It's a concept so revolutionary that many of the contemporaries when Jesus lived failed to get it. They didn't see what was happening right before it. And conceptually, we've heard it preached, we've heard it taught all the time. We know about it, and at times we kind of get it, but ultimately we mix it up. We often mix it up with our own plans. We like to blend it with our own level of getting a solution for himself. God himself will provide, and God's always on time. Isn't it interesting, the timing that God took to bring the solution to Abraham's problem? God is always on time, but we just hate the delay that he has. He looks at things eternally. We like to think in things in terms of instant. And God has an eternal and a global perspective. He not only looks at what it does for us, but he looks at what it does for the rest of the people around us, the rest of the people in our area, and then he looks at the whole thing of how it affects the people on this whole globe. And when we actually make a faith choice, we always give God always gets the credit for that. And Paul talks about that. Whatever is not of faith is sin. Whatever is done with doubt is sinful. When we do things tentatively, or when we just say, I'll try it, let's do them based on faith that this is for, and what do I mean by that? This is done for the greater good. This is done for eternal value. This is not just done for the moment. This is not just done because I think it's the wisest thing to do, but we do it because we do it for eternity. Otherwise, God calls it sin. And faith is always a choice. Faith has much more to do with God than it does with us. Yes, we get to make the choice. We can choose faith or we can choose fear. And as we become aware of our dependence on him for our next breath, for our next step, for our sustenance, for food, clothing, for shelter, we understand that faith is the only way to live. And or we can make our self-choices to make ourselves feel better, extract a little bit more comfort, or to prove ourselves right. So what if instead of always looking out for ourselves, we would loyally follow God's decision without any level of hesitation? Our faith would be tested. That's what happened to Abraham. He was at a point in life where he was finally feeling that it was working out, and that's when God tests us, when we think we are in a good place. That's why it's called a test. It wouldn't be a test if it just wouldn't be a test if we could just pass through it with flying colors. It's always going to be disruptive. It's always going to be something we don't invite. And as Abraham rounded every corner of that mountain, I'm sure he saw mirages of sheep ahead of him. And as he showed up, just like the person in the desert dying from thirst, sees springs of water a mile ahead, and as he shows up, it vaporizes. These sheep also vaporized. And Abraham built the altar, tied his son Isaac to that altar, and he lifted that knife. And again, we see his name called. And what does Abraham say? Again, those 4 words that are the first 4 words that we learned. Lord, here I am. And so the God of the universe, the God that hung the moon, the stars, and the sun in its place, also had enough miracles left to catch a sheep in a thicket. Now that happens every day. Hanging the moon and the stars probably doesn't. I know it doesn't, but a sheep gets caught in the thicket every day. But the timing and the location of it was a miracle. It was exactly at the right time. It was exactly at the right place, so that there would be no doubt in Abraham's mind or in our mind, this was God providing. Of course, God did this kind of provision. And Abraham, looking back over his life, looked at the times when he did it his way. Every time it resulted in drama, fits, arguments, yelling, things that weren't pleasant. And yet when he followed God, it ended in peaceful submission. And that's exactly what we need to do today. Jesus himself put a very high bar out there for us as disciples. He said in Luke 14:26, if you want to be my disciples, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else, your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters. Yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. There's a word in there that we try to avoid. It's the word hate. It's the same word of killing Isaac. We don't want to talk about that. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that we should hate those that are closest to us. And yet, God means it when he says, I am first in your life, and when I call, you say, yes, Lord, here I am. And you go early the next morning because I will provide. The story of Abraham and Isaac points to the cross, and that's where Jesus put his welfare ahead of us. My cross is the same. We put our welfare, we put other people's welfare ahead of our own. Yep. And we put the kingdom ahead of all of these. We put that ahead of our comfort, our relatives, and our personal dreams. And that's the description and the meaning of love, to put somebody else's welfare ahead of us. If Abraham could have time-lapsed, if he could have time-traveled 2,000 years earlier and been at the foot of the cross as Jesus died, he would have said, and so now I understand the depth of God's love for me. We can look back and say the same thing because of his faith story. My little story about the passport problems, that's not even close to talking about God's love for us. That only talked about Don and my frustrations and perhaps the power of prayer. But it takes a story of this magnitude. It takes a story like this for us to realize the depth of God's love. Because ultimately, faith and love are intricately combined. Faith starts with a desire for a better life, a better world. We want something better. We were designed for something better, and faith is that answer for that desire. But it takes more than just my feelings and my desires and wishful thinking for it to happen. Faith needs a power source, and of course that power source is a God of love. Even an almighty God wouldn't be sufficient if he wasn't a God of love. And if we interpret this story as only being about obedience, we miss its most important point. The obedience part of the story is Abraham responding to God's love. That's why the word love is mentioned for the first time in Genesis 22. Abraham was finally operating out of love. His love for his son had only one source. That source was God. The Apostle John tells us, we love because we have first been loved. We cannot generate love on our own. Abraham couldn't generate this love on his own for his son. You would think it's so natural, it seems like we can, but that love ultimately comes from God, and so does our love. And so that's where faith and love get connected, because we're just responding to that love that he has for us with the faith that he will take us through times when we don't know the future, when it looks gloomy, when we think we're not going to make it. And so we can choose faith or we can choose fear. And if we choose fear, we're going to keep on labeling people as good people, bad people, based on how they treat us. And we're going to impose our version of truth on everything. My opinion matters because it's my opinion. And we're going to erratically lurch from emotion to emotion because we're basing it on emotions and fears, and emotions get fed by fear. Or we can choose faith. And so we choose faith because we choose God's love. That is what faith is, choosing God's love. May we, like Abraham, respond with these phrases. Yes, here I am. And early the following day, and God himself will provide. I've asked Stu to give us, Stu wrote a prayer on faith. He's still writing. Yeah. But anyway, I don't mean to make this an info commercial. Come on up. But the Spirit asked me to start writing a weekly email on faith, and it's called 2 Minute Mark. And I'm asking you to sign up. The first subscription will be next week, so I'll pass out these cards, and I hope to see you sign up. Stu?
Thank you, Mark. Lord, I thought I had it figured out, calling my own shots in this vast universe, hopeless, only calling on you when in need, neglecting your everlasting love, causing constant pain, thinking I was okay. But Lord, you knew I became comfortable, not only with my decision making, but my addiction as well. Unaware, I strayed away from your never-ending hope and everlasting love, losing my faith you instilled in me as you created me, creating a pathway with extreme obstacles, making your reality a mere dream. As I went on hopeless, feeling alone, I got angry with you, Lord. I turned my back on you and continued doing it my way, recklessly destroying everyone that loves me. Clueless, I thought they were the problem. But today, Lord, I realize clearly that I am the problem. So I'm here, Lord. I surrender to you. I give you my heart. Take my fears, my hatred, and everything else I thought I had under control. Lord, I lay it all at the foot of the cross to sort my struggles out, knowing I am out of control and can no longer do it on my own. Lord, I now know if I change my unhealthy ways, you will provide through good and evil. But through my addiction, I must trust this process, taking action and being bold, honest with my loved ones, you, and most of all myself, never losing faith and giving up hope. In the Lord's name I pray, amen.